The smell hit me first, that cloying mix of expensive perfume and guilt that clung to Marlene like a second skin these days. She stumbled through our front door at 2:47 a.m., trying to look casual while her lipstick had migrated somewhere south of her chin, and her client meeting dress hung wrinkled like a used tissue. "Hey, honey," she slurred, kicking off her heels with the grace of a drunk flamingo. "Sorry I'm late. The Henderson showing ran long, then Lila wanted to grab drinks to celebrate closing the Morrison deal. Before we dive deeper into the story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories." I looked up from the stack of chemistry tests I was grading at our kitchen table, my red pen poised over Tommy Brennan's creative interpretation of molecular bonding. At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday? You know how real estate is. Marlene waved her hand dismissively, already heading toward the stairs. Time means nothing when commission checks are involved. Right. Commission checks. That's what we were calling Kyle Dempsey these days. I'd seen them together 3 weeks ago at Murphy's downtown, Marlene's tongue exploring the inside of his mouth like she was searching for loose change while his hands roamed her body like he owned the deed. When I confronted her, she'd laughed it off as networking and suggested maybe I was having another one of my paranoid episodes. The paranoid episodes, that's what she called it whenever I questioned her increasingly obvious lies, like I was some kind of delusional husband instead of a high school science teacher with functioning eyes and a working brain. "Evan, sweetie?" Her voice drifted down from upstairs, syrupy with fake concern. "Could you make me some of that herbal tea? The chamomile one? I'm feeling a little queasy." Queasy. Sure. That had nothing to do with whatever she'd been drinking or doing with Kyle. I set down my pen and walked to our kitchen cabinet, the one where we kept the tea and, more importantly, where Marlene had recently started storing what she claimed were vitamin supplements. Little amber bottles with labels I couldn't quite read, always positioned just so when I came home from work. The next morning, Marlene was up before me, bustling around the kitchen with the manic energy of someone trying way too hard to appear normal. She'd made pancakes, my favorite, she kept reminding me, and fresh coffee, and she was humming some pop song I didn't recognize while she flipped them with theatrical precision. "Good morning, handsome," she chirped, sliding a plate in front of me. "I thought I'd make you a special breakfast before your big day." My big day. Right. It was Wednesday, which meant I had 5 periods of sophomore chemistry and 1 period of AP biology, the same schedule I'd had for 3 years. But sure, let's call it special. The pancakes looked perfect, golden brown, fluffy, with just the right amount of butter melting on top. Marlene had even arranged fresh strawberries in a little heart shape on the side, like we were newlyweds instead of a couple whose marriage was circling the drain faster than hair in a cheap motel shower. "This looks great," I said, cutting into the stack. "What's the occasion?" "Can't a wife make her husband breakfast without an ulterior motive?" She perched on the edge of her chair, watching me with the intensity of a cat stalking a wounded mouse. "Besides, I felt bad about coming home so late. I know you worry." I took a bite. The pancakes tasted different. There was something underneath the usual vanilla and cinnamon, something that made my tongue tingle in a way that wasn't entirely pleasant. But I was hungry, and Marlene was being nice for the first time in weeks, so I kept eating. "These are really good," I said, though my throat was starting to feel scratchy. "Did you use a different recipe?" "Just added a little something special." Her smile was bright and sharp, like broken glass catching sunlight. "I thought you might like the extra flavor." The tingling in my mouth was getting worse, spreading down my throat like liquid fire. My skin felt hot and tight, and when I looked down at my hands, I could see red welts starting to form on my knuckles. "Marlene," I said, my voice coming out hoarse and strained, "what did you put in these pancakes?" Her laugh was light and musical, the same laugh she used when she was pretending something cruel was actually funny. "Oh, come on, Evan. Don't be so dramatic. It's just a little peanut flour. I wanted to see if you were really as allergic as you claim to be, or if it's all in your head like I've always suspected." The room tilted sideways. My chest felt like someone was sitting on it, pressing down with the weight of a truck. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't cooperate, and I ended up gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles went white. You put peanuts in my food?" Each word was a struggle, like trying to breathe through a straw. "Marlene, I could fade from this." "Oh, please." She rolled her eyes, but I caught something else in her expression, a flicker of uncertainty, like maybe she was starting to realize she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "You're being ridiculous. If you were really that allergic, you'd be gone by now." My vision was starting to blur around the edges, dark spots dancing in front of my eyes like angry bees. But even as my body betrayed me, my mind stayed sharp and focused, This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a joke. My wife, the woman I'd loved and trusted for 4 years, had deliberately tried to poison me to prove a point. With shaking hands, I managed to pull out my phone and dial 911. The operator's voice sounded far away, like she was calling from the bottom of a well, but I managed to gasp out our address and the word anaphylaxis before the phone slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor. Jesus, Evan, you don't need to be so dramatic, Marlene was saying, but her voice had lost its casual tone. She sounded scared now, which was funny because I was the one who couldn't breathe. It was just a test, just a little experiment. An experiment, that's what she called attempted murder. The EMTs arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. They found me on the kitchen floor, Marlene hovering over me with tears in her eyes. Real tears, not the crocodile variety she usually produced when she wanted something. Please help him, she sobbed to the paramedic, a competent-looking woman with graying hair and steady hands. I don't know what happened. He just started having some kind of reaction during breakfast. But I wasn't unconscious. Not quite. And when the paramedic asked me what I'd eaten, I managed to whisper, pancakes. She put peanut flour in the pancakes. On purpose. The look the EMT gave Marlene could have frozen hell. Ma'am, I need you to step back. Officer Morrison will want to speak with you. Officer Morrison turned out to be a tired-looking cop with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. While the paramedics worked on me, EpiPen, oxygen, IV fluids, he took Marlene aside and asked her some very pointed questions about the difference between accidents and intentional poisoning. From my stretcher, I watched my wife transform from concerned spouse to potential criminal in the span of 10 minutes. Her tears dried up fast when she realized she might actually face consequences for her little experiment. It was just a joke, she kept saying, her voice getting shriller with each repetition. He's always claiming to be allergic to everything. I just wanted to see if he was telling the truth. Just a joke. Like attempted murder was the punchline to some cosmic comedy routine. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught sight of Marlene on her phone, speaking in urgent whispers to someone who definitely wasn't her mother or her boss. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly who she was calling. Don't worry, I heard her say as the ambulance doors closed. He bought it. He always does. But she was wrong about that. Absolutely wrong. Because lying on that stretcher, breathing through an oxygen mask, and feeling the epinephrine course through my veins like liquid lightning, I finally saw my wife clearly for the first time in months. She wasn't the woman I'd married. She wasn't even the woman I'd been trying to save. She was something else entirely, something cold and calculating and utterly without conscience. And if she thought I was going to roll over and fade quietly, she was about to learn that even the most mild-mannered science teacher has a breaking point. The hospital released me 6 hours later with a prescription for stronger EpiPens and a stern lecture about avoiding known allergens. The attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, was less subtle about her real message. Mr. Colehart, she said, her voice carefully neutral as she signed my discharge papers, I want you to know that what happened to you today wasn't an accident. Peanut flour doesn't just accidentally end up in pancake batter. Someone made a deliberate choice to endanger your life. I nodded, still feeling shaky from the medication and the adrenaline crash. I know. The police will want to follow up with you. I strongly recommend you consider pressing charges. She handed me a business card. This is for a victim's advocate, someone who can help you understand your options. Marlene had left the hospital 2 hours earlier, after Officer Morrison finished questioning her. She tried to visit me in the ER, but I'd asked the nurses to keep her out. I wasn't ready to face her fake tears and manufactured concern. Not when I could still taste peanuts in the back of my throat. Instead, I called my neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Brody. At 73, she was the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator, Gossip Central Command, and the closest thing I had to a mother figure since my own parents faded in a car crash 5 years ago. Evan, honey, I heard the ambulance, she said, her voice crackling through the phone. Are you all right? What happened? Marlene decided to test whether my peanut allergy was real, I said. Turns out it is. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Mrs. Brody's voice came back, low and dangerous in a way I'd never heard before. That little snake tried to eliminate you. Mrs. Brody. Don't you Mrs. Brody me, Evan Michael Colehart. I've been watching that girl for months, and I know exactly what she's been up to. Every Tuesday and Thursday, regular as clockwork, she leaves the house at 2:30 and doesn't come back until after midnight. And don't get me started on the red BMW that's been parked 3 blocks away during her late showings. My heart did something complicated in my chest. You've been watching her? Honey, I've been watching out for you since the day you moved in. That girl's been stepping out on you for months, and now she's graduated to attempted murder. The question is, what are you going to do about it? What was I going to do about it? That was the question, wasn't it? I could file a police report, maybe get her charged with reckless endangerment or assault. I could file for divorce, split our minimal assets, and walk away. I could pretend none of this happened and go back to grading papers and teaching teenagers about chemical reactions. Or I could do something else, something more educational. Mrs. Brodie, I said, how would you feel about helping me conduct a little experiment? She cackled, and for the first time in hours I smiled. Oh, honey, I thought you'd never ask. The next morning, I went to work like nothing had happened. Marlene was still asleep when I left, or pretending to be, and I didn't bother leaving a note. Let her wonder where I was and what I was thinking. Lincoln High School was a typical New England public school. Red brick, tall windows, and the lingering smell of industrial disinfectant and teenage desperation. I'd been teaching there for 3 years, long enough to know which students were genuinely interested in science and which ones were just trying to get through another required course. Mr. C., Tommy Brennan called out as I walked into my first period chemistry class. We heard you were in the hospital yesterday. Are you okay? Word traveled fast in a school of 800 students. By lunch, half the faculty would know I'd had some kind of medical emergency. And by the end of the day, the story would have evolved into everything from a heart attack to a shark attack. I'm fine, Tommy. Just a minor allergic reaction. Nothing that won't heal. I set my bag down on the lab bench and looked out at 26 faces, most of them still puffy with sleep and teenage angst. But it got me thinking about something we could explore in class. How many of you know someone with a serious food allergy? About half the hands went up. Good. This was going to work. Allergic reactions are fascinating from a biochemical perspective, I continued, pulling up a slide on the smartboard. They're essentially your immune system making a catastrophic mistake, treating a harmless protein like a dangerous invader. The response can be swift and severe. Hives, swelling, difficulty breathing, even passing. Jessica Martinez raised her hand. My cousin carries one of those pen things. EpiPen? Exactly. Epinephrine auto-injectors. They buy you time, but they're not a cure. The only real treatment for a severe food allergy is complete avoidance of the trigger. I clicked to the next slide, which showed the molecular structure of various allergens. But here's the interesting part. Some people think food allergies are psychological, that they're all in your head, or that someone might be faking symptoms for attention. A few students shifted uncomfortably. This was hitting closer to home than they'd expected from their morning chemistry lesson. So, what would happen? I continued, my voice perfectly calm and educational. If someone decided to test whether an allergic person was telling the truth, say, by secretly introducing the allergen into their food? The classroom went quiet. Even Tommy Brennan, who usually treated my classes like background music, was paying attention. That would be attempted murder, wouldn't it, Mr. C? This from Sarah Kim, one of my AP students who was probably headed to MIT if her grades held up. From a legal standpoint, it could certainly be classified as assault with intent to cause bodily harm. From a scientific standpoint, it would be an uncontrolled experiment with potentially fatal results. I smiled, and several students shifted nervously. From a personal standpoint, it would be a betrayal of trust so profound that it would fundamentally alter the relationship between the experimenter and the subject. The bell rang, and students began packing up their books with unusual quiet. As they filed out, Sarah Kim lingered by my desk. Mr. C? Are you okay? I mean, really okay? I looked at her. 16 years old, brilliant, probably destined to cure cancer or discover new planets, and felt something settle in my chest. I'm going to be fine, Sarah. Sometimes people show you who they really are, and you have to decide what to do with that information. She nodded solemnly and headed for the door. As she reached the threshold, she turned back. For what it's worth, Mr. C, whoever did that to you is a monster, and monsters don't deserve to get away with it. Out of the mouths of babes. During my lunch break, I drove to Marlene's real estate office. Pinnacle Properties was housed in a converted Victorian mansion downtown, all gleaming hardwood floors and inspirational posters about making dreams come true. The kind of place that charged premium prices for mediocre service and called it luxury. Marlene worked as an assistant to one of the senior agents, which mostly meant she answered phones, scheduled showings, and occasionally got to tag along when someone important needed an extra pair of hands. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent money and gave her access to wealthy clients who might be impressed by her carefully cultivated image of sophistication. I found her at the front desk, typing furiously on her computer while talking on the phone in the bright, fake voice she used for potential customers. Absolutely, Mrs. Henderson. We can schedule another showing for this weekend. I know the perfect property for someone with your refined taste. She looked up as I approached, and her expression flickered through several emotions: surprise, guilt, fear, and finally settling on defensive irritation. "I'll call you back in just a few minutes, Mrs. Henderson. Something's come up?" She hung up and turned to face me, crossing her arms over her chest. "What are you doing here, Evan?" "I wanted to see how you were feeling today. You seemed pretty upset yesterday after your little experiment didn't go the way you planned." Her eyes darted around the office, checking to see who might be listening. Lila Santos, her closest friend and fellow assistant, was pretending to organize files while obviously eavesdropping from 3 feet away. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marlene said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Really? Because I remember you being very interested in whether my peanut allergy was real or just psychological. I thought you might want to know that Dr. Chen confirmed it's quite real. Life-threatening, in fact." Lila had given up any pretense of working and was now openly staring at us. I could see her mental wheels turning, processing this delicious piece of gossip that she'd be sharing with everyone in the office within the hour. "Evan, you're embarrassing me," Marlene hissed. "Can we please discuss this at home?" "Oh, I don't think we'll be discussing much of anything at home anymore." I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen, especially not after I listened to this voicemail you left for Kyle yesterday. Her face went white. The voicemail was mostly incoherent, Marlene sobbing about how everything was falling apart and how she needed to see him right away. But there were enough endearments and intimate references to make the nature of their relationship crystal clear. "You went through my phone?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Actually, you left it unlocked on the kitchen counter, right next to the bag of peanut flour you used to try to me." I smiled pleasantly. "Sloppy operational security, sweetheart. I expected better from someone who's been lying to me for months." Lila gasped audibly. This was better than any soap opera, and she was getting a front row seat. "Evan, please," Marlene whispered. "Not here. Not like this." "Why not here? You didn't seem too concerned about discretion when you were testing my allergies in our kitchen." I looked around the office, noting how every conversation had stopped and every eye was focused on us. "Besides, I thought you might want to clear the air with your colleagues. Let them know that your late-night showings aren't exactly what they seem." Before she could respond, the front door chimed, and Kyle Dempsey walked in like he owned the place. 6'2", perfectly styled hair, expensive suit, and the kind of confident swagger that came from a lifetime of getting everything he wanted without consequences. He took in the scene, Marlene's tear-streaked face, my calm expression, Lila's obvious excitement, and his jaw tightened. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, directing the question to Marlene but keeping his eyes on me. "No problem at all," I said before Marlene could answer. "I was just updating my wife on the results of her little science experiment. Turns out attempted murder is still illegal, even when it's disguised as breakfast." Kyle's face went through the same emotional journey as Marlene's, landing on a combination of anger and calculation that I found fascinating from a psychological standpoint. "I think you should leave," he said, stepping closer to me in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. I looked up at him. He had about 4 inches and 30 pounds on me, and smiled. "You know what, Kyle? You're absolutely right. I should leave. But first, I have a question for you." I pulled out my phone again and showed him a different screen. "Do you recognize this address?" It was the address of his downtown condo, along with a time-stamped photo of his red BMW parked in the residence-only garage. His face went pale. "See, the funny thing about adultery is that it leaves evidence. Photos, credit card receipts, hotel records. And the funny thing about evidence is that it becomes very interesting to divorce lawyers and insurance companies." I tucked my phone back into my pocket. "But I'm sure a successful businessman like yourself already knows that." I turned to leave, then paused and looked back at Marlene. "Oh, and honey, you might want to find somewhere else to stay tonight. I'm having the locks changed, and I'd hate for you to be stuck outside in the cold." The silence that followed me out of the office was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Brody. "How did it go, dear?" I typed back, "Phase 1 complete. Time for Phase 2. Her response came immediately. "I'll put the kettle on. We have planning to do." That evening, I sat in Mrs. Brody's kitchen, surrounded by the comforting chaos of a woman who'd lived in the same house for 47 years. Every surface held some treasure: ceramic figurines, family photos, stacks of mystery novels, and an impressive collection of coffee mugs from places she'd never visited but dreamed about. "So," she said, setting a cup of chamomile tea in front of me, "what's our next move?" I pulled out a yellow legal pad covered with my careful handwriting. "I've been thinking about this from a scientific perspective. If you want to understand a system, you have to map all the variables and identify the weak points. In English, honey, Marlene's world is built on lies and image management. She's convinced everyone that she's this successful, sophisticated woman who's married to a boring science teacher she's outgrown. But what happens when people find out who she really is? Mrs. Brody's eyes gleamed with something that might have been unholy glee. They stopped taking her calls. They stopped inviting her to parties. They stopped trusting her with their business. Exactly. Social destruction is much more effective than legal action, especially for someone whose entire identity is built on what other people think of her. I flipped to the next page of my notes. Kyle is different. He's got money, connections, and enough arrogance to think he's untouchable. But he's also got something Marlene doesn't have. What's that? A reputation to protect. He's the golden boy at Pinnacle Properties, drives a BMW he can't really afford, lives in a condo that's probably leveraged to the hilt. His whole life is a performance designed to impress clients and colleagues. Mrs. Brody nodded slowly. And if the performance falls apart, then so does everything else. I took a sip of tea and felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. But I need to be smart about this. No criminal activity, nothing that could come back to bite me legally. Just scientific observation and the occasional gentle push in the right direction. What do you need from me? I smiled. Information. You know everyone in this neighborhood, and everyone trusts you. If I'm going to map Marlene's social network, I need to understand all the connections. For the next 2 hours, Mrs. Brody gave me a master class in small-town sociology. She knew which neighbors Marlene had alienated with her pretentious attitude, which of her coworkers were already suspicious of her frequent absences, and which of her so-called friends were really just waiting for her to fall so they could feel better about their own lives. The key, she explained, is Lila Santos. That girl loves drama more than she loves breathing, and she's got a direct line to everyone who matters in Marlene's social circle. If you can get Lila on your side, she'll do half the work for you. And how do I do that? Mrs. Brody's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Honey, after what happened at the office today, Lila's already on your side. She just doesn't know it yet. The next morning brought a text from Marlene. We need to talk. I'm staying at my sister's, but this is ridiculous. You can't just throw away 4 years of marriage over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. That's what she was calling attempted murder now. I deleted the message without responding and headed to school. My first period students were unusually attentive, probably hoping for more drama after yesterday's impromptu lecture on allergies and trust. Instead, I gave them a pop quiz on molecular bonding and spent the class period grading papers while they struggled through questions about ionic compounds and covalent structures. During my lunch break, I drove downtown to Murphy's Pub, a dimly lit Irish bar that catered to the after-work crowd, and anyone else who needed a quiet place to drink away their problems. And it was also, according to Mrs. Brody's intelligence network, where Lila Santos went every Friday after work to complain about her job and gossip about her coworkers. I ordered a Guinness and settled into a corner booth where I could watch the door. At 5:47 p.m., Lila walked in with 2 other women I recognized from Pinnacle Properties. They claimed a high-top table near the bar and immediately launched into what looked like an intense conversation. I waited 20 minutes, then walked over to their table. Lila, hi, I'm Evan, Marlene's husband. I think we met briefly yesterday at your office. She looked up at me with the wide-eyed expression of someone who just won the gossip lottery. Oh, hi. Yes, of course. How are you doing? After yesterday, I mean? Her companions, a blonde woman in her 30s and an older brunette with calculating eyes, leaned in with obvious interest. I'm doing better, thanks. Actually, I was hoping I could buy you ladies around and maybe ask a favor. What kind of favor? This from the brunette, who introduced herself as Patricia Wells, one of the senior agents. I'm trying to understand what's been going on with Marlene lately. The woman I married wouldn't have... Well, let's just say she's changed, and I'm wondering if you've noticed anything at work. Lila and Patricia exchanged a look that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Evan, Patricia said carefully, I don't want to get involved in anyone's personal business, but there have been some concerns about Marlene's performance lately. What kind of concerns? She's been missing a lot of appointments, showing up late, and some clients have complained about her attitude. Patricia glanced around the bar, then leaned closer. And there have been some questions about her relationship with Kyle Dempsey. Questions? Lila couldn't contain herself anymore. They've been seen together outside of work. A lot. And not in a professional context, if you know what I mean. I nodded slowly, letting my expression show just the right amount of hurt and confusion. I was afraid of that. The thing is, I don't know what to do with this information. I mean, I can't prove anything, and even if I could... You don't have to prove anything, the blonde woman, who'd introduced herself as Karen, said firmly. Everyone already knows. The question is what you're going to do about it. What would you do? I asked. The three women looked at each other, and I could see the wheels turning. These weren't Marlene's friends. They were her co-workers, her competition, and in Patricia's case, probably her boss. They had no loyalty to her, and plenty of reasons to want her gone. Honestly, Patricia said, I'd make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person she really is. People deserve to know who they're dealing with, especially in our business where trust is everything. I bought them another round and listened as they shared increasingly damaging stories about Marlene's behavior over the past few months. By the time I left Murphy's, I had enough ammunition to destroy her reputation 6 times over and 3 new allies who were eager to help with the demolition. But I wasn't ready to pull that trigger yet. First, I wanted to have a conversation with Kyle. I found him the next evening at Elevation, an upscale restaurant downtown that catered to the kind of people who thought spending $50 on a steak made them sophisticated. He was sitting at the bar, nursing what looked like an expensive whiskey and scrolling through his phone with the intense focus of a man trying to avoid thinking about his problems. I slid onto the bar stool next to him and ordered a beer. Oh, Kyle Dempsey, right? I'm Evan Colehart. I believe you know my wife. He looked up from his phone, and I watched his face cycle through the now familiar sequence of emotions. This time, though, anger won out over fear. What do you want? He asked. Just to talk, man to man. I took a sip of my beer and studied his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. I'm curious about something. When you decided to sleep with my wife, did you know she was the kind of person who would try to poison someone to win an argument? His hand tightened around his whiskey glass. I don't know what you're talking about. Sure you do. Marlene told me all about your relationship, how you've been helping her with her late showings and providing emotional support during her difficult marriage. I smiled at his reflection. She's very grateful for your friendship. Look, whatever problems you and Marlene have, they don't involve me. Oh, but they do involve you. See, Marlene's been using your relationship to justify some pretty terrible behavior. She convinced herself that because she was unhappy in our marriage, she had the right to escalate things. Kyle turned to face me directly. Are you threatening me? Not at all. I'm just sharing some information that I thought you might find interesting. I pulled out my phone and showed him a screenshot of Marlene's text messages. Did you know she's been telling people that you're going to leave your girlfriend and marry her once her divorce is finalized? His face went white. That's not... We never discussed... Marriage? No, I didn't think so. But Marlene's been planning your whole future together. She's even looked at houses in your price range. I scrolled to another screenshot. This one in Riverside Heights is nice. A little out of your budget, but she thinks you could stretch for the right property. Kyle drained his whiskey in one gulp and signaled the bartender for another. What do you want from me? Nothing, really. I just thought you should know what you're getting into. Marlene's the kind of woman who tries to eliminate her husband when she wants out of a marriage. Imagine what she might do to a boyfriend who disappoints her. I left him at the bar, staring into his whiskey glass like it might contain answers to questions he was afraid to ask. 2 days later, Mrs. Brody called with an update from her intelligence network. Kyle broke up with her, she reported with obvious satisfaction. Apparently, he showed up at her sister's house yesterday evening and told her he thought they should take a break and reevaluate their priorities. How did she take it? About as well as you'd expect. According to Janet Morrison, she lives 2 houses down from Marlene's sister, there was screaming, crying, and what sounded like something expensive being thrown against a wall. I felt a small, dark satisfaction settle in my chest. What about work? That's the interesting part. Lila called me this morning. She's dating my nephew Danny. And apparently, Marlene showed up to the office looking like she'd been hit by a truck. Red eyes, no makeup, wearing the same clothes as yesterday. Patricia Wells sent her home and told her not to come back until she could present herself professionally. The dominoes were starting to fall, exactly as I'd hoped, but I wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I drove to Lincoln High and spent an hour in my classroom preparing for what I hoped would be the final phase of my experiment. I had parent-teacher conferences scheduled for the following week, and I wanted everything to be perfect. After all, some lessons are too important to leave to chance. Parent-teacher conferences at Lincoln High were always a circus, but this year's fall session promised to be especially entertaining. The school had recently implemented a new community engagement policy that encouraged teachers to present their curriculum in creative ways that would help parents understand what their children were learning. Most of my colleagues found this requirement annoying, but I saw it as an opportunity. I spent the weekend preparing a presentation titled Trust, Betrayal, and Chemical Reactions, a Study in Cause and Effect. On the surface, it was an educational overview of how chemical bonds form and break, with real-world applications that parents could relate to. Underneath, it was something else entirely. The presentation was scheduled for Wednesday evening in the school auditorium. Parents would rotate through different subject presentations every 20 minutes, giving teachers a chance to showcase their programs and build community support. I arrived early to set up my materials, a laptop connected to the main projector, several demonstration kits arranged on lab tables, and a small display of student work that highlighted some of our more successful experiments. Everything looked perfectly normal and professionally educational. At 7:15 p.m., about 40 parents filed into the auditorium and took seats in the first few rows. I recognized most of them. Lincoln High wasn't that big, and after 3 years of teaching, you got to know the families pretty well. What I didn't expect was to see Marlene slip in through the side door and take a seat in the back row. She looked terrible. Mrs. Brody's intelligence network hadn't exaggerated. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and she was wearing a wrinkled blouse that looked like she'd slept in it. But she was here, which meant she was still trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Still trying to play the role of the supportive teacher's wife, even though everyone in town probably knew by now that our marriage was over. Perfect. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice carrying easily through the auditorium's sound system. "Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to learn about what your students are discovering in chemistry and biology class." I clicked to my first slide, which showed the molecular structure of sodium chloride, common table salt. "Chemistry is fundamentally about relationships," I continued. "How different elements interact with each other, what happens when those interactions are healthy and stable, and what happens when they become toxic or destructive." A few parents nodded politely. This was exactly the kind of educational content they'd expected. For example, sodium and chloride form a very stable bond. They complement each other's properties, and together they create something essential for life. But if you introduce the wrong element into that relationship, I clicked to the next slide, showing what happened when you added water to the mix. Everything changes. I moved to one of the lab tables and picked up a small beaker of clear liquid. This looks like water, doesn't it? Perfectly harmless. But appearances can be deceiving. I added a few drops of phenolphthalein indicator, and the liquid turned bright pink. Sometimes what looks innocent on the surface is actually highly reactive, and if you're not careful about what you expose yourself to... I trailed off and looked directly at Marlene in the back row. She was staring at me with growing horror, finally understanding where this presentation was heading. "The same principle applies to human relationships," I continued, turning back to the audience. "Trust is like a chemical bond. It takes time and the right conditions to form, but it can be destroyed very quickly if you introduce the wrong elements." I clicked to the next slide, which showed a before and after comparison of two molecular structures. The first was stable and symmetrical. The second was broken and chaotic. For instance, imagine a marriage where one partner decides to test whether the other partner's life-threatening allergy is real or fake. From a scientific standpoint, this would be called an uncontrolled experiment with potentially fatal results. The auditorium had gone very quiet. Parents were looking around at each other with confused expressions, sensing that something was happening but not quite sure what. Now you might ask, what kind of person would conduct such an experiment on someone they claim to love? The answer is simple: someone who has already introduced toxic elements into the relationship, someone who has compromised the fundamental bonds of trust and loyalty. I moved to another lab table and picked up a small vial of clear oil. This is peanut oil. For most people, it's completely harmless, but for someone with a severe peanut allergy, exposure to even a small amount can cause anaphylactic shock, respiratory failure, and passing. I held up the vial so everyone could see it clearly. 3 weeks ago, someone deliberately added peanut flour to my breakfast. Not as an accident, not as a mistake, but as a test. They wanted to see if my allergy was real or if I was just being dramatic. The silence in the auditorium was now complete. Even the parents who didn't know me personally were leaning forward, riveted by what was clearly becoming a very public confession. The person who did this claimed it was just a joke, just a harmless experiment. But as I explained to my students, there's nothing harmless about deliberately exposing someone to a substance that could eliminate them. I looked directly at Marlene again. She was gripping the sides of her chair so hard her knuckles were white, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. "But here's the really interesting part," I continued. "The same person who tried to poison me was also conducting another kind of experiment. She wanted to see if she could maintain 2 different relationships simultaneously, one with her husband and one with her married coworker. A few parents gasped audibly. This had officially moved beyond educational presentation into public spectacle, but nobody was leaving. If anything, more people were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. From a scientific standpoint, this kind of dual relationship is inherently unstable. Too many variables, too many opportunities for the system to break down. And when it does break down, I clicked to my final slide, which showed a chemical reaction in progress, molecules flying apart in all directions. The results can be quite dramatic. I set down the vial of peanut oil and looked out at the audience. The lesson here, for your children and for all of us, is that actions have consequences. When you introduce toxic elements into any system, chemical or human, you can't control what happens next. The bonds that once seemed unbreakable will shatter, and the damage is often irreversible. I paused for effect, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. But sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. Sometimes the only way to create something healthy and stable is to let the toxic system destroy itself completely. The auditorium erupted in whispers and excited conversation. Parents were looking around, trying to figure out who I was talking about, while others were already pulling out their phones to text friends and family about what they'd just witnessed. In the back row, Marlene stood up abruptly and headed for the exit, but she wasn't fast enough to avoid the dozen phone cameras that tracked her movement, or the whispered conversations that followed her retreat. "Thank you all for your attention," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "I hope this presentation has been educational. If you have any questions about your child's progress in chemistry or biology, I'll be available after the other presentations conclude." As parents filed out to attend the next session, several lingered to speak with me. Some offered support and sympathy. Others wanted more details about what had happened. A few just wanted to make sure they understood the gossip correctly so they could share it accurately. But the most interesting conversation came from Patricia Wells, who had apparently decided to attend the conferences even though she didn't have children at Lincoln High. "That was quite a presentation, Evan," she said, approaching my table as the auditorium emptied. "I hope it was informative." "Oh, it was very informative, especially the part about toxic relationships in the workplace." She smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "I think you'll be interested to know that Marlene won't be returning to Pinnacle Properties. We've decided that her personal issues are incompatible with our professional standards." I nodded. "I'm sure that was a difficult decision." "Not really. After what happened tonight, I suspect it would have been difficult to keep her on anyway. Our clients expect a certain level of discretion and professionalism." She was right, of course. By tomorrow morning, everyone in town would know exactly what Marlene had done, and why her marriage had ended. Her reputation was finished, her job was gone, and her social circle would shrink to nothing within a matter of days. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the end of a very long, very exhausting chemistry experiment. I packed up my materials and headed home to a house that felt different now, quieter, cleaner, and entirely my own. The fallout from my presentation spread through town faster than a chemical chain reaction. By Thursday morning, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts from people I hadn't heard from in months, all wanting to know if the rumors were true and if I was okay. Mrs. Brody knocked on my door at 8 a.m. with a pot of coffee and a stack of local newspapers. "You made the Herald," she announced, settling herself at my kitchen table like she owned the place. "Page 3, right next to the school board meeting recap." The article was brief and diplomatically worded, something about an unconventional presentation at parent-teacher conferences that had sparked community discussion about trust and relationships. But anyone who'd been there, or who'd heard the story secondhand, would know exactly what it was really about. "How are you feeling, honey?" Mrs. Brody asked, studying my face with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "Tired," I admitted, "but good, like I can finally breathe again." "And Marlene?" "I haven't heard from her since Tuesday. I assume she's still staying with her sister, trying to figure out what to do next." Mrs. Brody poured herself a cup of coffee and settled back in her chair. "Well, she won't be doing it here. Word is that Patricia Wells made some calls yesterday, and none of the other real estate agencies in town are interested in hiring her. Apparently, attempted murder is bad for business." I should have felt satisfied by this news, but instead I felt something more complicated. A mixture of relief, sadness, and a strange kind of emptiness. For months, my life had been consumed by Marlene's betrayal and my plans for revenge. Now that it was over, I wasn't sure what came next. "What about Kyle?" I asked. "Oh, that's the best part." Mrs. Brody's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Turns out his girlfriend, the one he was supposedly going to leave for Marlene, found out about the affair. She works at the bank, and she had some very interesting information about his financial situation." Such as? Such as the fact that his fancy condo and his BMW are both leveraged to the hilt, and he's been using company credit cards to pay for his dates with Marlene. Patricia Wells is conducting a full audit of his expense reports, and the word is that he'll be lucky to avoid criminal charges. The domino effect was even more complete than I'd hoped. Kyle's arrogance and financial recklessness had made him vulnerable, and once the pressure started, his entire carefully constructed life had begun to collapse. "So what now?" Mrs. Brody asked. "You've got your house back, your reputation intact, and 2 enemies who won't be bothering you anymore. What does Evan Colehart do for an encore?" It was a good question. For the first time in months, I had no experiments to plan, no revenge to plot, no lies to uncover. My life was my own again. "I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to focus on teaching. Maybe write up some of this experience as a case study for my students. There are some interesting lessons here about cause and effect, about the importance of understanding consequences before you take action." Mrs. Brody smiled. "And maybe about the danger of underestimating quiet people? Especially that?" The next few days passed quietly. I went to work, taught my classes, graded papers, and slowly began to reclaim the routines that Marlene's chaos had disrupted. My students were fascinated by the rumors they'd heard about the parent-teacher conference, but I deflected their questions with gentle humor and redirected their attention to actual chemistry. On Friday afternoon, as I was packing up to leave school, Principal Hanks knocked on my classroom door. "Evan, do you have a minute?" David Hanks was a good principal, fair, supportive, and genuinely interested in helping his teachers succeed. He was also politically savvy enough to recognize when a situation needed careful handling. "I wanted to check in with you about recent events," he said, settling into one of the student desks. "I've been getting some calls from parents and school board members about Wednesday night's presentation." My stomach tightened. Am I in trouble? Not exactly. Most of the feedback has been positive, actually. Parents appreciate teachers who are passionate about their subject matter, even when that passion takes unconventional forms. He smiled. "But I wanted to make sure you're doing okay, personally and professionally." "I'm fine, David. Better than I've been in months, actually." "Good, because I have a proposition for you." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "The district is looking for someone to develop a new curriculum module about real-world applications of chemistry and biology, something that would help students understand how scientific principles apply to everyday situations." I could see where this was going. "You want me to turn my personal disaster into a teaching tool?" "I want you to take your expertise in making science relevant and accessible and use it to help other teachers do the same thing." He stood up and headed for the door. "Think about it. It would be a promotion, a salary increase, and a chance to influence science education throughout the district." After he left, I sat alone in my classroom, looking out at the empty desks where my students would sit on Monday morning. In a few hours, I would go home to my quiet house, make dinner for one, and probably spend the evening grading papers or reading. It sounded perfect. That evening, I was settling down with a cup of tea and a stack of biology quizzes when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Marlene standing on my front porch, looking nervous and defeated. I considered not answering. We'd said everything that needed to be said, and I had no interest in rehashing the past or listening to more excuses. But curiosity won out, and I opened the door. "Hello, Marlene." She looked even worse than she had at the conference. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes were rumpled, and she had the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. "Can I come in? Please? I just need to talk to you for a few minutes." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside and let her into the living room. She looked around at the space that had once been ours, taking in the changes I'd made, the photos of us that I'd removed, the books I'd rearranged, the general sense of a space that was now occupied by only one person. "The house looks good," she said quietly. "Thank you. Evan, I need you to know how sorry I am. About everything. The breakfast, the lying, Kyle, all of it. I know I can't undo what I did, but I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go so far." I studied her face, looking for signs of genuine remorse or just another performance. What I saw was exhaustion, defeat, and something that might have been real regret. "What do you want, Marlene?" "I want to know if there's any chance, any possibility that we could work things out. Go to counseling, start over, try to rebuild what we had." The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the weight of 4 years of marriage and months of betrayal. A few weeks ago, I might have been tempted by the possibility of reconciliation, by the chance to go back to the comfortable routines of our shared life, but that was before I'd learned who she really was underneath the carefully constructed facade. before I'd discovered what she was capable of when she felt cornered or threatened. "No," I said simply. "There's no chance of that." She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "Evan, please. I know I made mistakes, but you tried to eliminate me, Marlene. You deliberately exposed me to something that could have stopped my heart, and you did it to prove a point about my character." I kept my voice calm and level, but I could feel anger building underneath the surface. "That's not a mistake. That's not a momentary lapse in judgment. That's attempted murder. It was just supposed to be a small reaction. You didn't think I would actually fade, or you didn't think you'd get caught?" I shook my head. "It doesn't matter. Either way, you made a choice to risk my life for your own satisfaction. That's not something you come back from." She started crying then. Real tears, not the calculated performances she'd used to manipulate me in the past. But even genuine remorse couldn't undo what she'd done. "I've lost everything," she whispered. "My job, my friends, Kyle. Everyone in town knows what I did. I don't have anywhere to go. That's not my problem anymore." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. Marlene had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. That was how chemistry worked. Actions and reactions, cause and effect, with no exceptions for regret or good intentions. "I'll sign whatever divorce papers you want," she said finally. "I won't fight you on the house or the savings or anything else. I need you to know that I'm sorry." "Okay," I said. "I believe that you're sorry. But that doesn't change anything." She nodded and stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I guess I'll go back to my sister's, figure out what to do next." "Marlene?" I called as she reached the door. "For what it's worth, I hope you figure out how to build a better life for yourself. Somewhere else with someone who doesn't know what you're capable of." She looked back at me with something that might have been gratitude, then walked out of my house and out of my life. I locked the door behind her and returned to my tea and my stack of biology quizzes. Outside, the autumn wind was picking up, rattling the windows and scattering leaves across the yard. But inside, everything was warm and quiet and mine. 6 months later, I was standing in front of a room full of teachers from across the district, delivering a presentation about real-world applications of scientific principles. The curriculum module I'd developed had been approved by the school board and was being implemented in all the district's high schools. "The key," I told my audience, "is helping students understand that science isn't just about memorizing formulas and conducting lab experiments. It's about understanding how the world works, how different elements interact, and what happens when you introduce new variables into established systems." I clicked to a slide showing a chemical reaction in progress, molecules breaking apart and reforming in new configurations. Change is inevitable in any system, whether it's chemical or biological or social. The question isn't whether change will happen, but whether we'll be prepared to understand and respond to it when it does. After the presentation, several teachers approached me with questions and ideas for implementing the new curriculum in their own classrooms. It was gratifying to see their enthusiasm, to know that my experience, painful as it had been, might help other people understand something important about cause and effect, about the consequences of our choices. That evening, I drove home to my quiet house, made dinner for one, and settled down with a book and a cup of tea. It was a simple life, maybe even a boring one by some standards, but it was honest and peaceful and entirely my own. As I read, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Mrs. Brody earlier that week. She'd mentioned that Marlene had left town, moved somewhere in the Midwest to start over. Kyle had declared bankruptcy and taken a job selling insurance in another state. Both of them were gone, their impact on my life reduced to a few unpleasant memories and a hard-won understanding of human nature. "Do you ever regret it?" Mrs. Brody had asked. "The way you handled everything, I mean. Some people might say you went too far." I'd thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I regret that it was necessary," I'd finally said. "But I don't regret defending myself, or making sure they couldn't hurt anyone else the same way." That was still how I felt. Marlene and Kyle had made choices that put them on a collision course with consequences. I hadn't created those consequences. I'd simply made sure they couldn't avoid them. In chemistry, we call it a catalyst, something that speeds up a reaction that was already going to happen. I'd been the catalyst in the breakdown of their carefully constructed lies, but the reaction itself had been inevitable from the moment they chose deception over honesty, cruelty over kindness. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a successful experiment. I'd hypothesized that actions have consequences, that lies eventually collapse under their own weight, and that even the most mild-mannered person will fight back when pushed too far. The data had confirmed my hypothesis completely. Science, I reflected as I fell asleep in my own bed in my own house, was a beautiful thing.